I don't know. I guess someone has to kick it off, right?
One of us should definitely be talking. How long have we been recording?
Like 4 seconds? I don't know. It's raining outside, y'all. It's gross.
Are we just sitting here not recording?
We're
No,
recording.
we're sitting here recording. We're just not speaking.
Sitting here recording nothing?
I mean, I guess
We can't put out dead air.
we
We
could
are the
we could
only
do a
group of
more
people that can talk about
experimental.
nothing and it'd be fine.
Experimental.
Yeah, we could do a more experimental type of podcast, you know.
Very UFO.
Maybe it's like jazz, where podcasting is about the notes you don't play. Is that what people say about jazz?
Is it? Just roll the opening. Welcome back to National Disability Radio. I am one of your hosts, Michelle Bishop, Voter Access and Engagement Manager at NDRN.
And I'm Stephanie Flynt McEben, Public Policy Analyst with NDRN.
And our producer, who keeps trying to sneaky call himself a host.
Hi, producer and host. Really bit of everything, kind of, the workhorse of the podcast, if you will. Jack Rosen here. How are you doing, folks?
Not the workhorse of the podcast. Okay, wait. So we're kicking off our ADA special?
Yes, this is the first for our series of interviews with folks who were involved in fighting for passage of the ADA. And for this one, we have on an old friend. Michelle, you want to tell people who we have?
So for the very first in our series on the ADA, we actually have a good friend of the podcast, Curt Decker, who is actually the former executive director of NDRN. He actually founded the National Disability Rights Network in 1982 and led the organization for 40 years? Yeah, about 40 years. Before that, Curt was actually the director of the Maryland Disability Law Center, which is the Maryland P&A. He was also the director of the Help Resource Project for Abused and Neglected Children and was a VISTA worker prior to being a senior attorney for Baltimore Legal Aid Bureau. So Curt has deep roots in Maryland and the DMV and was our fearless leader for Stephanie. Were you here when Stephanie?
I was very
Okay.
briefly. So I started in 2021 and then Curt retired in summer of 2022.
Okay, so every single one of us can say that Curt was once upon a time our fearless leader before Marlene Aseo took the helm of NDRN. So in addition to all that, Curt actually was instrumental in the creation and passage of the ADA and was on the White House lawn the day that it was signed. And he's here today to tell us about that experience. Curt, did you go to Hamilton?
Yes.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah, that's that was so weird about my life. I grew up in Albany, went to Hamilton. I got accepted at Brown, but frankly, Hamilton gave me more money, so I went to Hamilton. We needed money was an issue, and then I ended up at Cornell for law school and took the New York bar. Came down to Baltimore for 1 year as a legal aid attorney, and never went back. And then never practiced law in New York. I'm a total waste of time to take the New York bar. And they still call me now to please, I'm long gone. Anyway, and then after I did a couple things in Baltimore, got hired by Maryland Disability Law Center, or whatever, which was not called, it was called something else then. It was the very first iteration of the P&A system when it was only developmental disabilities, and then I helped, the story. I helped form the National Association with a bunch of other execs around the country because there wasn't anything, and then started going over to Washington because I was the closest guy there, maybe other than DC, and started representing at NAPAS, it was called then, sort of first as a volunteer, then as a paid consultant, then executive director.
Well, what did you do when you were actually at the Maryland P&A?
I was executive director. I got hired. I was running a child abuse program for the state of Maryland, and I knew people around. I got a call from one of my board members who was involved. She said, "There's this new thing that was created by Congress called the Protection and Advocacy Systems, and it's supposed to investigate abuse and neglect of people with disabilities, and we need someone to take it over and make it work." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about disability. I have no contact with the disability community at all. I never had a disability. I really didn't have any relatives with it. So this is way." And they said, "No, we don't care. We need someone who can get this thing together and make it work." And I said, the child abuse program was another federal grant. It was winding down. So I said, "Okay, I'll try it. And I was lucky. It was right around, when 94 142 came into existence, the Rehab Act. I mean, so I was like, oh, these are kind of interesting legal issues. I never knew about this. So, and then I went out to a Rosewood State Hospital, and the director there locked me in the day room with a bunch of, adult folks with developmental disabilities, and tried to scare me. And it was like, fortunately, I wasn't scared. It was a great story. I walked in, these men were there. They looked around. There was a new person in the room, so they got all excited, and they started coming towards me. And it was like, oh, this is interesting. And I smiled, and they all smiled. And it was like, that's when I realized that, these. Then I spent we tried to close Rosewood. We finally closed it in 2010. I started in 1979, and it took 30 years to close that crap hole down. So when I was there were 3,000 people at Rosewood, and then eventually we kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And so I was it was called MAUD, the Maryland Advocacy Unit for the Developmentally Disabled, MAUD. And I was the executive director for 3 years.
I actually did not realize you started as the executive director,
Yep.
or that there were 3,000 people in a single institution.
Oh, well, Willowbrook was 7,000. Those places are big.
I did not
Very
know that.
big, very big. I think Willowbrook, we always tell that story, in the history of the P&As, it was the largest facility for people with intellectual disabilities in the world, I think, and a nightmare. You've seen that video a million times, I'm sure. Anyway, so then I started. I spent some time. I left Maryland, but I was working for NAPAS, but part time. I had other clients. I had clients in Annapolis, and I was representing. Well, it's now called AAIDD, but it was called AAMR at the time. Remember? And I was working part time. I was working on the CAP program. And I was sitting in the DC P&A office writing stuff, and we got the CAP program, and then we got the CAP grant, and then that was enough to allow us they hired me full time, and I think that's when I hired Sally Rose, and off we went. We had PAD, we had CAP, and then we got PAMI, and just kept going.
That's funny. My mentor, when I started out in Independent Living Center in Missouri, and my mentor was one of our original disability lobbyists in Missouri, and he got into that work because he was working in an independent living center, and they had a bill they wanted to get passed. So he was like, well, they didn't have a lobbyist then, so he was like, well, I'll go.
Yeah.
And went and found someone to sponsor the bill, and they were like, we'll take care of this. And he went back to St. Louis, and they didn't do anything. And then of course the bill went nowhere, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And that was when they learned the lesson that if you're not there,
that's right,
pushing for it, it's not going to happen. And it sounds like the P&As were created, and then you understood that if you're not there, somebody's not in DC protecting what we have and building upon it, it's not going to happen.
And that was exactly right, because I ran this child abuse program. I had done that for 4 years, and again, they were all over the country, sort of a similar model. And we'd have these meetings, and I would say to people, and I helped organize an association, of those child abuse programs for the same, because they were federally funded. When I got to the P&A, and I started talking to the other executive directors, in that early days, ADD had money, and they brought us all together for a meeting. And it was like, well, who's representing us in Washington? Well, Paul Marchand, the ARC is the guy who is looking. That doesn't make any sense. So but we had big fights. The first fight was whether we should have a national association. There were a bunch of executive directors. Well, the people will tell us what to do from Washington if we have that. And of course, they were right. That's exactly what happened. Over the years, they kept saying, "Here's a new program. Here's a new program. Here's a voting program. Shut up, take it." Whether you want it or not, and then, we had that battle, and we created the National Association. Then we had to so we need dues, we need money, and people say, oh, no, we can't charge, we can't use our federal money to pay dues, and they'll take money away from direct services, and we had the big fight about that, and so then we created a dues structure, and then that started getting us a little bit of money. That's when they could hire me as a consultant. But each one of those developmental stages was a fight, and as you well know, we've been fighting ever since. But some of these states, some of the P&As, we don't want this Social Security program. Shut up, take it. It's great.
I'm a little bit biased, but I'm glad that they took the voting program.
Yes, I guess I am too. I worked on that. I worked really hard on that. It should have been $10 million. That was with the Help American Vote Act, but we only got 5. We never got. What's up to now? About 8 or 9?
Yeah, it's
Fine.
grown.
Yeah.
It's grown.
Anyway. Well, don't get me going about history. I can go on for days.
Actually, that is somewhat the point of this.
That is the point. Yes.
Right.
We're doing a series about the fight for the ADA,
Right.
leading up to the anniversary of the ADA, and we were just hoping you could tell us about your experiences being a part of that fight to create the ADA, get it passed into law, get it enforced, all of that.
Sure. I can do that. Do we need to start free going here, and or do you have specific questions, or do you want me to just start talking?
I feel like tell us a story.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I mean, as I remember it, and it's about some other people. It's the earliest iteration was like the National Council put together a whole report on the need to well, first I mean way back. We had the Rehab Act of 1974, where that banned discrimination based on federally funded and federally conducted programs, and so from 74 till about the late 80s, that was in place, and that's we and other people would use that to go after, again, federally funded or federally conducted, somewhat broad because you had a lot of federal contractors, but people realized that that was pretty, on the other hand, pretty narrow, and there was a whole other world out there that was not covered. So the National Council started with a proposal to do this, have a whole new discrimination bill that would cover everything. And it was sort of a blueprint, and didn't really go anywhere, but it got people organized around it. And it's initially, it was kind of controversial because the original thing was it was going to be a flat Earth position. That everything had to be accessible. And when we started meeting with people, I met with Weicker and Tom Harkin, with Bobby Silverstein and some other people, and it was pretty clear that wasn't going to go anywhere. Because people would say things like, "Well, what do you do with the New York subway? What do you do with all of these old buildings? What do you do with Amtrak? I mean, you just can't mandate automatically a flat Earth." So that sort of changed. I think Pat Wright was someone who actually kind of came up with this idea. We'll go from the flat Earth to a line in the sand. We're going to draw a line in the sand. The day this thing passes, everything new is going to have to be accessible, and we'll just live with the old stuff. I mean, there's just not much we can do about that, and maybe over years things will get better. And so we formed this coalition of all the disability groups. And I mean, I always tell people that one of the things that I thought was terrific was that everyone sort of put down their cudgels and stopped fighting with each other and sort of came together as a unified group. We created a grassroots group. We created a group in Washington that met regularly, and we started getting in. Tony Coelho was sort of taking the lead in the House, although he disappeared. I never figured out why he just left the Congress overnight, and so Steny Hoyer picked it up, and then of course Weicker, I think, moved on, and then Lowell Weicker was very important to us as well. He's the person I got the CAP program and the PAMI program from. And he had a child he was a Republican from Connecticut. He had a child with a disability. Anyway, so we began the process, and it was a pretty hard slog in terms of, because if you think about it, now what we're doing is we're taking on the entire country, every business, every major organization, and they're organized. So you have the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business, you have the National Restaurant Association, you have Amtrak, you have the Catholic Church. The one story I always tell people about is that the reason why churches are not covered by the ADA is pretty much because the Catholic Church came in, and the Senate especially, I remember that hearing really well, where they came in and said, we do not want to be covered by the ADA. We would have to hire, for example, we will have to hire people with HIV, which means they're gay, and we don't want to have gay employees. So there was this really interesting connection between homophobia and disability discrimination. And that's one of the reasons why churches are not covered. And so today, the church across the street from my house in Baltimore, they just spent a bunch of money putting in ramps, but it was all voluntary because there's no requirement. I think churches sort of figured out that so many of their constituents are old that they better have things that are accessible. So that was one story. then we the two, as I remember, in trying to kill the bill, these national associations, the two big issues at the time, 88, 89, were AIDS and mental health. And so the National Restaurant Association came in and demanded to have their staff of restaurants excluded. And their theory was that, and it sounds ridiculous now, but I spent many, many hours, we all did, talking about blood in the salad. And the Restaurant Association said that if we have to hire or keep waiters, staff that have HIV, they're going to cut themselves, bleed in the salad, and they'll give AIDS to their customers. And there was an amendment in the House called the Chapman Amendment to try to eliminate food workers from coverage of the ADA under this whole shibboleth of AIDS. And so that was used as a sort of a stalking horse to try to throw the whole, people just wanted to kill the bill. And so that was one way of trying to do that. And the same thing was with mental health. We'll have all these mentally ill people, Amtrak. They use that a lot. And we would give things like, well, what are you talking about? You have people with mental illness on Amtrak now. You have no way of keeping them off. So the idea that, so then we got into all these sort of side arguments. The Chapman Amendment passed the House, but we got it knocked out in the Senate. So that never happened. So there was no food worker exemption. Catholic Church won, but the Restaurant Association did not. I spent a lot of time with I think Congressman Dingell time on Amtrak. One of the things that Amtrak, and you probably know this from all the work that we did later on at NDRN, Amtrak came and said, we're old and broken, and we have all these, terrible stations, and the Congress doesn't like us, and they don't give us enough money, and there's no possible way we could make Amtrak accessible. And we went back and forth, and we said, okay, we hear you. So we'll give you 20 years. And there were various different negotiations like that, where I think we gave over-the-road bus companies like Greyhound and Peter Pan 5 years. We gave Amtrak 20 years. And so there were all these, we gave city buses 30 days because the theory was that, 30 days after passage, you did not have to you could buy an accessible bus. And so they got one of the shortest timelines. But other people over the road buses were like, well, we don't turn them over that often, so we need 5 years. And and I think you probably know what we found out in 19 years later, Amtrak did nothing. And that's when we jumped in and did the report and started, and DOJ took the report and sued. And that's when Ken and I started meeting with Amtrak like quarterly and yada, 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 and all of that. As he tried to get them to, but it was pretty outrageous that they let 19 years go by without, and some of that was, I always tell people that some of it was on us. We didn't pay attention. We ignored them, and we thought, oh, they're doing it. And we never really checked to see if they were. And when we finally found out they weren't, it was like, so kind of embarrassed. We should have stayed on top of that. So, and then the other thing I remember is it really was a time when the entire disability community came together. And I do remember some very specific moments sitting in a congressman's office with Lee Page from Paralyzed Veterans, in a wheelchair, some blind people from NFB and other, and you'd get the conversation like, well, you don't want to cover HIV, right? You'll be willing to take that out, and they would say, no, we don't. No, we're not going to slice off unpopular disabilities from this thing. We're going to stick together, and we want the whole thing. We want everybody to be included, and we're not going to we'll make these side deals for depending on different industries, but basically. And I thought that was an incredible moment when the disability community really came together and unified and said, we're not going to throw different people off the boat. Because right now they're very unpopular.
That's one of the things that's always really incredible to me about the ADA is that it was this moment where the community stood together, and the definition of what a disability is and who's protected being so incredibly broad, I think is so powerful. I did not know. The homophobia that was wrapped up in all that is wild to me. I'm not eating a salad with anyone's blood in it.
Right, exactly.
That's when you send it back.
Right. That's right. Or even with a hair or a roach for that matter. But it's like, yeah, no, it was that was a side issue in there that, kind of, because everyone knew if you think about, you're probably too young, but 1988, it was height of the AIDS crisis. There was very little in the way of, I think ACT sort of came around, and we didn't discover HIV till 85, and then it was like 87, 88. There was really no cure. It was pretty frightening, and people were pretty hysterical about that. And so that seeped into this whole issue about disability discrimination. And of course, the mentally ill have always been unpopular and still are, and still scapegoated.
And you were at the signing of the ADA at the White House, weren't you?
I was. So, there was, where was I? So the signing was quite an event. And it was Sandra Perino from the National Council on Disability and Evan Kemp, because, people sort of did still kind of credit the National Council on Disability starting the ball by coming up with that, as I said early on, that original report, which I don't think really ended up. It was sort of the basis, but the actual bill was quite a ways removed from that initial "we want the world" concept. And those pictures of the signing. It was a great day. It was a great day, but it was hot. And every time I've ever gone back to the White House for subsequent celebrations, it was always in July, and we were just miserable. So I always tell people, let's get the bill signed in October. The other thing that we did when we finally got, we lobbied to get a statue of Franklin Roosevelt at the Roosevelt Memorial in a wheelchair. The original design did not acknowledge at all that he had polio and that he was in a wheelchair. And so we fought for that, and we got that. And that ceremony was in December. And so like, here we go. We're either freezing or boiling. So
you need to plan bill passage like a wedding. You got to shoot
yes
for the fall.
Absolutely.
White House, you got a suit on and everything. It can't be
right. Oh my God, one of the worst, just dreadful. It might have been. Was it the 20th? Was it 5 years ago? It might have been earlier than that. And it's 90 degrees. And they also had Patti LaBelle was going to sing. And of course, the president and everybody else is in the White House. Cool. We're out on this lawn just dripping. And out comes Patti LaBelle. And we're like, great, this is going to be fabulous. And she starts singing, and she's going to sing, New Attitude. And we're all bopping around. And then she goes off the deep end about her sister, her husband. She's my Shiro, and I was just well, you couldn't have been worse. We just sort of crawl. I would drag myself over to the W Hotel to get a drink. It was just so it's it was great. We all want to be there. We should definitely all be there, but it doesn't come without its downsides in July. Let's see. I'm trying to think of some other things that happened in the actual lobbying experience that were. So the things that I worked on were the Chapman Amendment, the Amtrak stuff, in all of tons of meetings with individual, a lot of the meetings with Harkin and Hatch to try to, bring the Republicans over. So I don't know. Is this all? I don't know if this is all helpful at all.
No, it is. This is amazing.
Yeah.
This is stuff that we want to, record and get down, because like you said, Stephanie and we weren't there. I only know of it through legend.
Yeah, no, it was a major. To this day, and it still needs to be enforced. I think Maryland just ended up suing the Baltimore City for curb cuts because things are still bad in a lot of places. And of course, Amtrak, just blew us off. The other things that are interesting, airlines are not covered because there was a separate Air Carrier Access Act that passed earlier, and that Ken and I did some regulation negotiations with the airlines. Housing's not in there because we'd gotten disability into the Fair Housing Act in 1988, I think, and that was an interesting experience as well. That's when I ran into Wade Henderson for the first time, and he was adamant about. His position, which I understand, was you can't open up the Fair Housing Act to add disability. If you do, other forces will come forward and try to rip the whole thing apart. So he was pretty anti adding a disability, but we went forward and we got it and we were able to save it. But that's one of the reasons with Eric, and I always like, the DD Council, for example, wants to, reauthorize the DD Act. And it's like, no, don't go there, because they'll leave you alone. They'll come right after the P&As. They'll come after the Access Authority. They'll come after the Legal Authority. You do not want to open up this bill. So I understand the theory about not opening up established law for a good reason. And that was what happened. You probably know that, we had to do the ADA Amendments Act because we started getting, you pass a bill and it looks great and you think you've covered all the bases, and then it goes into the courts. And then over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, we were studying getting one horrible opinion after another. And Sandra Day O'Connor was sort of the culprit in the Supreme Court, because it came to, let me see if I get this right. The bill came to the Supreme Court. Oh, I know what happened. So the case was, there were 2 women pilots that flew regional airlines, and they wanted to be promoted to the big airplanes, which was where the money was. But you had to have 20/20 vision, and they were denied. And their lawyer brought a lawsuit under the ADA saying, there's discrimination. And, it wasn't, on the surface, it wasn't, if you were a pilot of a big airplane and you needed to wear glasses, you're fine, but you couldn't get to be a pilot if you needed glasses. So it goes to the Supreme Court, and we're hysterical because it's like, yeah, we do not want to get this bill before the Supreme Court. And sure enough, Sandra Day O'Connor rules that if, yes, they have a disability in terms of poor eyesight, but they can ameliorate the disability by putting on glasses. And if you can fix the disability, you're not covered. Well, that just blew the whole employment section of the ADA out the window, because think about it. You're mentally ill, you take lithium. Oh, you cured your disability. Getting in a wheelchair. Oh, well, you're no longer disabled because you're ambulatory. I mean, the ramifications were just stupendous about being able to fix your disability, and therefore not being covered. So we had to go back, and after telling the whole disability community for years, do not open up this bill. Do not don't you dare. We don't. So things we'd like to change. No way, because we opened this up, and all those things that we beat back originally in 1989, 90, will come back to haunt us. But then we had to reverse course, because this was so bad and just wiped out all the protections of the ADA that we went back. And I fell blue myself. I think Andy Imperato, who was working, I don't know where he was at the time, was the AAPD, and we met. And we got the Chamber of Commerce in, because they were relatively supportive the first time around. And we renegotiated. Jennifer Mathis renegotiated. The Leadership Conference was involved, and came up with a definition of disability, that said, if you had these conditions, you were covered. And it didn't make any difference what you did. You put on glasses, you were on a crutch, or you had drugs, or diabetes. And it was like, wait a second, tell me the diet. And people with epilepsy were getting thrown out of court because, you can take your seizure medication, so you're no longer a person with a disability. I mean, it was devastating. All based on a pair of eyeglasses.
I actually do not know much of any of that. I'm going to be honest. I didn't know any of that. And as aware of glasses, I am offended.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what's interesting about that story is, you work on a bill, you think you've got it covered, you pass it, great, fabulous, big celebration, go to the White House, and then it goes into the world and it starts getting used, and things start to happen, and it starts going to courts, and you get the backlash. We got huge backlash about back problems. A lot of people, a lot of not great lawyers would, you come in. I was fired from my job. Oh, why? Well, my boss. Do you have a disability? Well, I have bad back. Okay. You were fired because you're disabled. And so we got a whole bunch of cases in the early years of, these mostly back issues, but lawyers who were looking for a way to defend their client would try to glom, even though the fact that they were fired had nothing to do with any impairment. They're fired because they're a lousy worker, but that's what lawyers. And then we started getting this really bad reputation. The bill was getting a reputation for being all these insignificant cases, and it was being abused. We got into a whole thing around accessibility stuff with restaurants. I remember there was a big hoo-ha with Clint Eastwood, who owned a restaurant out in California, and he came out and he went to Congress. And of course, there's nothing worse in the world than to watch a congressional hearing with a movie star. These congressmen just fall apart and just lap it up. I mean, that's why people are always trying to get movie stars to come and testify, because the whole committee shows up, they just drool over them. And he got a lot of play about the abuse of the ADA, making his restaurant bathrooms accessible. Shut up. So, and there were attempts at trying to amend the ADA around that as well. So it's just just getting it passed. ain't enough. You've got to watch it and see how it spins out into the world and how it gets used not so well, abused, and then you have to deal with the backlash the thing like as I said, I think it was 86 or 96, the ADA Amendments Act. You go back in and try to clean that up, and then we had to do the stuff with Amtrak. Still are. I think Ken he's better now. Is still probably meeting with them. So that's what I know, and that's what I can remember anyway.
So I also think these days there's so much wild misunderstanding about the ADA. I have heard people say, oh, you have to hire people with disabilities where you can have a blind person drive a school bus. That's not how it works, right? Or, oh, you're going to have a service boa constrictor and bring them into a restaurant. That's not how any of this works.
I want to drive a school bus. Just kidding.
No, that's so go back. Let me tell you about this. So one of the things we did do in 1989 is, because we had the experience of the 74 Rehab Act. So all these concepts of reasonable accommodation, essential function of the job, readily available, readily achievable, these are all concepts that had developed all through the 70s and 80s about how you interpreted the non-discrimination. So, as employment, you had to be able to do the essential function of the job. Well, if you're blind, you can't drive a bus. So you were not covered. You cannot use the ADA to have a blind bus driver. You had to be able to do the essential function. So what we said, just like that whole story about the flat Earth going to, okay, well, can't do that. We'll draw a line in the sand and go forward. We also talked about putting the donut over the hole. The ADA was going to be the donut that sat over the concepts of the 74 Rehab Act, which we thought was smart because it was like, these are tried and true concepts. Reasonable accommodation had been out there for decades, over a decade, and so did readily achievable. And these were the things that were the sort of the balance to the statute, that something had to be readily achievable to make it accessible, and if it was going to cost $1 zillion and bankrupt, so if you're a bodega on the corner and you had, you now had to make your store accessible, but it was going to bankrupt you, that was not readily achievable. So you weren't covered, and you didn't have to do that. If you were a big corporation, your ability to do readily achievable was a lot greater. So there was trying to strike these balances, and the same thing with reasonable accommodation. The accommodation had to be reasonable. You just couldn't demand to do things, accommodations in the workplace that put in. I've never been a fan of Mother Teresa because she fought us on not wanting to put an elevator in her businesses, it was a compromise, and it was a reasonable bill trying to use these concepts that we thought people did fight back, obviously, but it was a good, I think, strategy to build on what had already existed and not come up with all kinds of new weird things, because, as I said earlier, we were going after the entire country, every doctor's office, every dry cleaning establishment, every restaurant, you name it, and it was going to be covered under the ADA, and that was terrifying to a lot of businesses.
Okay, I'm thinking about it now. I'm about to look it up. I'm pretty sure the Mother Teresa I remember from my youth was using a wheelchair at some point. Is that true? I'm wondering if that changed her stance.
I don't know, Michelle. I really can't tell, but I know she had like 2-story buildings, and she refused to put elevators in there. But we always said. And the other thing with things had to be like the program accessibility. So if you had a program, if you had a building without an elevator, you just had to make sure the program was available. So you bring the program down to the first floor in order to accommodate a person with a disability. So there were these kinds of trying to come up with some reasonable as a way, one, to head off opposition, but two, to be fair and not bankrupt places. And then, of course, then we had the other abuse was these drive-by lawsuits. You probably, I remember, I don't know if they're still going on, but again, some fairly unscrupulous law firms would go get a person with a disability, travel around to a whole bunch of places, liquor stores, restaurants, and they'd go in and they'd say, "Oh, your bathroom isn't fully accessible," and the restaurant would say, okay, thank you, I'll fix it. They fix it, and then they get a letter from the lawyer saying you owe us $2,500 for attorney's fees. And they would do that like 50 or 60 times. They did a lot in California, a lot in Florida. And then, so where'd the businesses go? They went right to their Congress and said, we're being ripped off. We made the fix. And yes, if we went to court, we would win, but it's going to cost me $5,000 to hire a lawyer to fight it. And this guy wants $2,500. I'll just pay it and get them off my back. Well, it was, and then we started getting all these Congress people who wanted to amend the ADA because of all of these, it was all these frivolous lawsuits. Well, they weren't frivolous. I mean, there was a violation, but it was fixed, and so it was just a scam by a couple of law firms who saw an opportunity to. So you always have to be on guard for these kind. Everything can get abused. The tax code's abused. Everything is abused. You don't throw it out, but you try to deal with it. I remember calling a couple of those law firms, trying to talk them, to negotiate with them about, you're killing us here, and giving the ADA a really bad name. And they didn't care. They were making money.
So what, in your mind, even though you accidentally, it sounds like, fell into working in the disability rights movement a long time ago, it clearly became a life's passion. What do you see as the new frontier in disability rights? I think the ADA has changed so much about the lives of people with disabilities. It can't be overstated how incredibly important the ADA has been, but a lot has changed since 1990. In your mind, what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, it's a good question. I've been retired now, and so I don't spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. And I have a little bit of contact with a few people out there once in a while. It'll be interesting to see how. You're absolutely right. By the way, you're absolutely right. It had changed the face of the country. As I said, for all of the downsides and the fights and abuse that happens, it has been a phenomenal piece of legislation. I think it's something like George H. Walker Bush said it was his biggest accomplishment. It really was an impressive, a massive kind of thing that really changed the whole face of society. Not that there aren't curb cuts that need to be done and I would make, I guess one thing I would think about is like all this, and I don't know much about it, but all AI and all these new technologies, making sure that they adjust and adapt. And I think the disability community has to be pretty vigilant. I have to laugh. The fact that the Musk and the president wants to do, self-driving cars, like that's a good thing. We want it, right? We want self-driving cars so people who are blind can have cars. That would be cool. I was not unhappy to see the paper straws go away because we objected to the paper straws. They're doing away with plastic straws because people, with wheelchairs and quadriplegics really needed something stronger, that they depended on to survive. So who knows? In a weird way, a couple of their little stupid things could actually have some benefit. So the future of the disability stuff. I think it's. It'll be interesting, technology, I guess, helping people walk who are wheelchair bound, what impact that's going to have on, is that going to be considered no longer a disability? So the technology could have a pro and con. And I think that would be something that we'll have to watch carefully. Although I guess right now the most immediate threat is maybe when we talk about the future, how about talk about next week when they do away with the Department of Education and screw up, the IDA and they did it. The EEOC's been devastated, and the Department of Labor's discrimination. And we did work. I did a lot of work with them, trying to make sure they were going after 14C violations and also just in general discrimination based on disability. And so a lot of what's going to happen with the disability rights section, Department of Justice. So, it's nice to think about the future, but let's talk about, the future as in next month when they try to, and it's really odd, we survived pretty well during the first Trump administration. He didn't care. We were not a base issue. They were on immigration, and they kind of left us alone. And we sort of stayed under the shadows, as you know. I couldn't believe we got the Social Security bill, one of the biggest programs we had in the Trump administration. And he didn't know what he was signing, thank God. And I was having a little bit of a crisis of conscience when I was like, well, when we finally got it passed, and I was like, oh God, if he has a signing ceremony, do I have to go there and stand behind him? I'll spit. But he was not going to do that. He didn't care about disability. Now, all of a sudden, it does seem like, and again, I don't know if it's so disability focused. It's going to have impact. If you do away with the Department of Education, well, what's the Department of Education? It's Title I and IDA, are two of their major, biggest programs. So I see Carol Dobeck a lot here. She goes to the wine shop. You probably heard this story. I used to jump on her when I was working, and then I still see her every once in a while and say, "What's going on?" See what's happening with OSERs and RSA. She did think they were going to lose a lot of their probationary employees. But so that's, So I do think there's a very real, very current threat right there. And then if we can weather this storm, think about your question about where are things going to go in the future.
I think you're right as well that disability rights is such an interesting movement because our opponents and our champions always come from both sides of the aisle.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel like that's really unique.
And we were very careful to stay nonpartisan. That was always sort of a mantra of CCD and all the other, all of us is like, just don't make this a partisan issue or we'll lose because we need those Republicans. And it worked pretty well, but I don't know what's going to happen now. I mean, so where are these people, where is Susan Collins and all these people about IDA? We'll see.
We did actually do an episode of this podcast with Stephanie behind the wheel of a self-driving car.
Great. Stephanie. Yeah, so I guess to give credit where credit's due. So plastic straws and self-driving cars might be a legacy of the Trump administration. I'm incredibly, I as you said, I dropped into the disability world sort of unplanned and without any previous history, and got very excited about. I mean, from a lawyer's point of view, there were some really great legal issues, but then just in general. I've always kind of been a sort of a civil rights-y kind of guy. So I was lucky that sort of saw early on that this was a major civil rights issue along with race and LGBT and sort of spent my life doing that. And I'm really grateful that I didn't go to New York as a corporate lawyer, which is what Cornell Law School told me I should do. So I got saved. I was very lucky.
I can't imagine you being a New York corporate lawyer, to be honest. This was probably the right path.
It turned out it was for me. I was, that's the other story I tell people all the time. When I was in Cornell, it was a very conservative law school. All the classes were tax, business, the corporate, everyone. And there was no, not like now. Law schools have clinics with civil rights clinics, and High Hellblum used to have an LGBT clinic at Georgetown. Nothing. So I just didn't know that it could be a public interest lawyer, and then I had to. Dodged the draft, and I joined Vista, and they sent me to Baltimore Legal Aid. And that first year was like, oh, I didn't know you could do this. I didn't know you could represent poor people and go around and fight, Medicaid system and all that stuff. And it was like, this is kind of cool, and I'm really good at it. I think, and they offered me a job, and I stayed, never went back. I'm sitting in my Baltimore house right now. Never went back to New York, and it was a good thing.
I feel like that is everything I can think of to ask about. Stephanie, did we miss anything?
No, I think that we covered it. But yeah, thank you so much, Curt, for being willing to talk about your lived experience during the passage of the ADA and just, giving us, some insights to share with our listeners. We totally appreciate it, and we appreciate your time today. And it's really been great. And like I said, I love stories. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Sure. I enjoyed it. It was really fun. Brought back a lot of memories. So great. Well, good luck. And I hope things get better. And I hope, very great. Good talking to you all. It was fun.
It's always great getting to catch up with Curt. He has such a wealth of knowledge about the disability rights movement, how, they accomplished the passage of the ADA and so many other milestones for this movement. That is fascinating, the part about blood in the salad and how they just showed solidarity and did not waver on these issues. It's really impressive.
Yeah, I'm here for it. And Curt is such a great storyteller as well. So just kind of listening to his insight, it was just, it was really, really great to get to hear from him. You know what else is great?
We should have asked Curt to stay for this part. I would love his reaction.
Oh, yeah, we shouldn't let him go. But Stephanie, please tell us your joke of the month.
Oh, yeah, of course. Absolutely. How much do rainbows weigh?
How much do rainbows weigh?
Do you find these on popsicle sticks? Like,
Sometimes I get them from other sources. Yes, sometimes they're originals. This one is from a source, but I thought it was fun, so we're doing it.
Okay, how much do rainbows weigh?
I got nothing.
You ready? Jack, do you have a guess? Come on.
We never have a guess. Somebody has to have a guess.
Right? Michelle, you used to guess all of the right answers.
I know that was a scary time in my life. I have no idea. Stephanie, please tell us.
Okay. How much do rainbows weigh? Not much. They're actually pretty light.
I like that one. That one's funny.
That one's not bad. That one's not bad. Wait,
Oh, thank you.
if we're doing a series for the anniversary month of the ADA, does that mean we're going to have multiple jokes this month?
Yes.
Oh.
And there's a very special joke, I believe, that's probably coming to you at the end of the month. So stay tuned.
I'm sure everyone's so excited.
Yes. I'm excited. I almost told it this episode, but we've got to give the people anticipation. The 2 listeners to this podcast.
All 2 of our listeners, I'm sure, are very excited to hear this joke. Jack, where can people find us on social media?
You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads. I think that's all of them. Maybe we'll make a MySpace.
Oh my gosh.
Write in to podcast@ndrn.org if you think we should make a MySpace. Until next time, folks.
Bye.